So here we are on the last session of the day, and I'm very happy to introduce Richard Watson, who has very, very kindly got up at 5 a.m. in London. And in fact, he lives very close to Linfield in the UK, which is very fitting. And so let me introduce Richard's background. He'll be speaking on Are We Confusing Connectivity with Communication? If you look him up on Wikipedia, he's the 8th most famous Richard Watson. He's the 2nd most famous Richard Watson who's still alive. But there have been bishops, singers, cricketers, philosophers, and politicians. And now we have Richard Watson, the author. He's an English writer, lecturer, and scenario planner, known for his books Future Files, which is a fantastic read, which looks into all sorts of aspects of the future. Especially, he's also known for his trend graphics that he does most years. The 2010 one was particularly good. It was laid out like a London Underground map, and if you go on his website, nowandnext.com, you'll also be able to download, the thing that I like particularly is the extinction timeline. It's a timeline predicting when things will stop happening and when things will become extinct over the years. It's very, very good. So he's written 4 books, so I've mentioned Future Files, but he's also, I think the second to last book that he wrote was Future Minds, and it's in that context that I invited him to speak here today, because it talks about the effect that modern technologies are having on our brains and our society, and I thought it was a very fitting way to finish this session talking about minds and machines in the future, to get his perspective on how this might change the way we live in the future. So with that, I will hand straight over to Richard. Oh, I got to say what your name means. I've done this. Richard's the only person to have spoken at this event twice as well. It means brave power, coming from Rick, meaning power, and hard, meaning brave. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Scott. I'd like to go back. I've actually got 3 screens open at the moment, which is confusing the hell out of me, despite the fact it's 5 a.m. Now, I'd briefly like to talk to you about something called the Dining Dead, amongst other things. And this was something I first observed about 6 years ago at a restaurant in Bondi. And just as the menu arrived, so did a couple in, I guess, their early to mid-20s. And they were seated at a much better table by the window. And after about 15 minutes, the man brought out a ring and he proposed. And there were a few tears, there was some kissing, and there was a little bit of conversation, which went on for about 2 minutes. And then there was this sort of rather awkward silence, and each reached for their mobile phone. And the next hour, at least, until the bill arrived, was spent frantically texting, telling friends and family, I guess, the happy news. Now, I think to some extent we can excuse this couple, but what really concerns me here are the increasing numbers of people, husbands and wives, friends, couples, rooms full of complete strangers, that seem to be using mobiles to hide from each other or to, ironically, prevent communication. And you can see this everywhere. It happens in cafes, on buses, at the beach, in conferences, and once you really see it, you just can't stop seeing it. It's absolutely everywhere. It's sort of as though someone, even somebody we know really well, has become too difficult to deal with without digital filters. Or perhaps it's that the information about what's happening elsewhere has created some kind of fear of missing out, and the result of that means that we're never fully present with anyone or anywhere. So in short, we're becoming quite ill at ease in the physical presence of other people and ourselves. And when we do communicate face-to-face, it seems that we only do this with the tacit acknowledgement that our mobiles are left switched on and that any conversation we're having may be interrupted at any moment. Now, I think this is sort of fine on one level, but surely what we're saying here, to the other person in particular, is that any device, or more specifically any information portrayed on that device is more important than the person we're physically with. And I think this is making us rather insecure to some extent, not unreasonably. And the irony here, obviously, is that on one level we think that mobile devices are facilitating connection, and in reality they're kind of doing the opposite. Modern communications, in a sense, are destroying meaningful communication. They're also isolating us from each other and, critically, the world at large. I mean, on trains and buses and planes, most people no longer look out of the windows, they look down at their knees. Prams, I've noticed, which in my day, interestingly, the child used to face the parent, the pram faced the parent that was pushing it. It now seems to be the other way around, that the child is facing outwards. And invariably they're pushed by a parent or somebody who's on the phone. So the parent is not connected to their child, who's right there in front of them, but with other people who are not. And it'd be quite interesting to see what the sort of long-term psychological effects of that are, but I'm sure it's having some kind of effect. Now, I don't need to repeat the number of people worldwide that own phones and have phone subscriptions and mobile devices. With regard to phones, suffice to say that in the UK, almost 10% of 5-year-olds now own a mobile phone, and by the ripe old age of 10, it's 75%. And this is despite government advice, I think, that says nobody should have a mobile phone until they're about 12. But the word phone, in many respects, is rather misleading. Using a phone to speak to somebody is very much becoming the exception globally. Communicating via voice globally is falling through the floor, whilst communicating via data, and I'm talking particularly about text, but also pictures and video, is going through the roof. Now, historically, texting became popular because it was very cheap. And I think a lot of people soon realised, young people soon realised, that text-based communication offer a greater level of control too. Phone calls are quite intrusive. You can put in answer machines in the way these days, but even so they can be a little bit intrusive, whereas we can respond much more easily when to respond to a text message, and on one level they're sort of easier to get rid of, to delete. Now, does it matter that we're communicating with each other more via text than voice calls these days? Well, I think it does, actually, because with text, and this isn't just texting, this is email as well, it's very difficult to convey tone. And even if you do pick up a phone to talk, it's impossible to pick up on body language. Now, using something like Skype, as we're doing here, can improve the situation slightly. But even here, we can lose important elements of communication. I mean, you, for example, cannot see that I'm wearing pajamas and got Wellington boots on, and I'm not quite sure what that says, but it says something. So, it's quite sort of poor level of visual representation compared to if I was standing right there in front of you right now. And according to some people, once we step away from physical face-to-face communication, we can lose around 90% of the clues that reveal our unspoken intentions or feelings of the other person. 90%, which is a fairly substantial amount. So, yes, on one level, we are communicating more than we've ever done before throughout human history, and that must be a good thing. And we shouldn't get too worked up about this, because how we communicate and what we communicate about have always changed. But I do wonder these days, due to the use of text, due to the sheer volume of things, how much of substance is being said, and more critically, how much is really being listened to or understood. Most of it seems to be on broadcast rather than receive a lot of the time. Now, left unchecked, my concern is that this situation could result in a growth of major misunderstandings and mistakes. And at the extreme, it could mean that we become increasingly fragile, nervous and insecure, partly because very large parts of our identities will have been created externally by the affirmation and validation of others, and will be subject to the whims and weak ties that are found on our online networks. I share, therefore I am. I have no messages. Nobody has liked my photographs on Facebook, therefore I do not exist. Now, I think there are three broad things going on here. The first, as I've said, has to do with how communicating by text in various forms is different and arguably inferior to communicating face-to-face, and maybe resulting in a decline of empathy, increasing fragility, and major growth of misunderstanding. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting everybody just switches off completely. I text, I email, I Skype. All of these technologies are extraordinarily useful. But in my view, and I think it's almost the critical message, all of these technologies should only be used to enhance, not to replace, human relationships. Now, the second theme, and this is clearly linked, has to do with interruption. We have somehow become so uncomfortable with ourselves and with others that we can't be alone long enough with ourselves or with them to dig deep into a human soul due to various flashes, vibrations, beeps, pings and rings, which is somehow more alluring. Now, why might this be so? How could it possibly be that a brief two-line text can be more alluring than the person you're seated opposite in a fancy restaurant in Bondi and the one you've just agreed to share the rest of your life with? How is that possible? And I think the answer very simply has to do with our Stone Age brains. When we receive messages or mail, it's as though someone is thinking about us. We feel important, we feel wanted, or at least we feel as though we exist. And we literally feel good about ourselves, of course, because each tile of communication is accompanied by an attachment. And the attachment is a shot of dopamine, which, as you probably know, is a pleasure chemical released by the brain to reward certain kinds of behavior. And guess what? The dopamine system is most powerfully stimulated when the information coming in is a bit of a tease, modest enough to intrigue, but not quite large enough to satisfy. Now, it's hardly surprising in this context that a company built on 140 characters or less can be worth 27 million US dollars. Now, also, when we receive information through our mobile devices, it's essentially unpredictable, which is again alluring. If we knew the general character of a tweet or a text in advance, it obviously wouldn't be that thrilling. It's a little bit like every email, every tweet, every update, every post or message is the sequel to the best box TV set we've ever seen, and we still don't know how it ends. Now, if you're wondering about some of the real-life effects of disruption, there was an experiment at Carnegie Mellon University in the US, and it found that distraction, and this is the interesting bit, combined with an anticipation of distraction, made people 20% more stupid. Now, another study in the US looking at multitasking, which I've always maintained was a bit of a myth without any evidence whatsoever, but this study looking at multitasking found that if you're trying to think whilst having a second screen open, this is equivalent to a loss of 10 IQ points. Now, clearly you can multitask with low-level things. You know, you can walk across the road and chew gum at the same time, but if you're walking across the road, chewing gum and texting, you could quite possibly end up dead. And in case you're wondering what a loss of 10 IQ points is, it's like being in the office whilst having smoked 1.5 joints of marijuana, or trying to work whilst having been awake for about 36 hours straight. And if you don't know what that feels like, I suggest you get a job in advertising and you'll find out soon enough. Now, the third theme, and it's intimately connected with the first two, is to do with thinking and the brain. Now, clearly, we have become very good at finding things fast, and again, this is great. To have the world's information, or a great deal of the world's information at our fingertips, is a fairly wonderful thing. It's become much easier to share things, especially ideas and information, and I'm really excited about this as well. The prospects of increasing collaboration, not only in science, but in politics, media, and just about everything else is a wonderful development. But my worry here is around deep thinking. Screens, as I've said, are really good for finding, filtering, and evolving things. But I think the price we're paying for this could be the erosion of sustained, focused, contextual, and reflective thought. In other words, deep thinking. And part of the problem here is simply finding enough quiet time to really think. Another issue is around originality and inputs, the data we put into our brains. Now, again, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of information around, too much actually, you could argue, and a lot of it's quite original, but because we seem to be in a constant rush all of the time, and because we're constantly being interrupted all the time, particularly by mobile devices, we end up doing what's most convenient, which is that we all look in the same place for information. So, for example, only 1% of Google searches proceed beyond the first page of results. 99% of people don't go any further. Now, I don't think this is a particularly big problem if you're looking up the telephone number of Iceberg's restaurant in Bondi, but I'd speculate that it does matter considerably if we're trying to increase the sum of all human knowledge, and we're literally all on the same page. Now, I could go on, but it's about 5:19 a.m., so I should probably get off and go back to bed. But I'd like to leave you with 3 practical things that you can do tomorrow to improve your relationships, to work smarter, and counterintuitively perhaps to get more done. And the 3 things are, the first one, not entirely surprisingly, is to do with switching off. The second one is understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different communication technologies. The difference essentially between paper and pixels. And if you get this week's copy or the November 1st copy of New Scientist magazine, the front page story is about exactly that. And the third one, and I think it's very appropriate times over here in England, is sleeping your way to the top of the organisation. Now, the first one is to do with switching off. Now, I clearly don't mean we all turn into a bunch of neo-Luddites. I don't mean permanently switching things off or throwing things away. But I do think we need some kind of balance in our lives. And the trick is probably to ritualize being without our blinking devices once a week, or maybe even twice a week, what used to be called the weekend. If you could do it for a week a year as well on holiday, that would be fantastic. So perhaps Saturdays or Sundays should be a day of rest and recharging, not just for our mobile devices, but for us too. If you could switch everything off at 8 o'clock at night, that would be fantastic. And critically, this rule must apply to all members of the household, not just those aged under 12. Now, the other thing I think you need to do is switch off, we need to do is switch off and not thinking about work all the time. Scott mentioned this book I wrote a little while ago called Future Minds, and when I was about halfway through the book, I decided I needed information about where people did their best thinking. So I got in touch with very close to about 1,000 people, all ages, all genders, professions, geographies, and asked them where they did their best thinking. And two interesting things came out of that. First of all, only one person said at work, and they were effectively lying, because they said at work really early or really late when nobody else is there. So in other words, when the office is not really functioning as an office. And the other thing that really stood out was nobody, not a single person, mentioned mobile technology. Now this was about 5 years ago, so it's quite possible that this would change a bit, but I suspect it wouldn't change very much. And this wasn't just true of 40 and 50-somethings, who you might expect this from. This was true of teenagers, 20-year-olds, and so on. Incidentally, if you're wondering where the best places to do thinking are, the top 5 was, not surprisingly, when I'm alone. So back to that office example. The second was last thing at night or in bed, so this links to sleep. The third one is in the shower, and very interestingly, water came up a lot. Walks by the beach, rivers, lakes, baths, showers. The fourth thing was very early in the morning. And the fifth thing was in the car and driving or running. And the fifth one's quite interesting because our minds are doing something, but it's quite a low-level task, and it frees up different parts of the brain to think about other things. So the sort of outtake from that, I guess, is if you want to have a good idea, the first thing you've got to do is stop going to work and trying to have a good idea. Go for a walk, turn on the TV, possibly, certainly get a book out, look at the ceiling, have a walk on the beach. Stillness, silence, and slowness, I think, are all hugely underrated age when it comes to having insights and solving problems. Now, the second thing I'd encourage you all to do is to try to match the technology at hand to the task or problem. And paper is as much as a technology as a Kindle or an iPad. In other words, appreciate that the paper and pixels have different strengths and weaknesses. And again, it's not that one good, one bad. They're both good at certain things and both weak at certain things. Screens are great for connecting people, for collaborating and exchanging information, especially on tightly defined problems, and they're great for finding out things fast, particularly small things. Paper, it seems, and the evidence is still emerging here because all of these technologies are so new and we still don't know that much about the human brain. Paper seems to be good for contextual understanding, for meaning, for complex arguments, and one I definitely agree to myself, spotting errors and mistakes. I mean, when you write a book, trying to sort of spot errors on a screen I find extraordinarily difficult. It seems to be incredibly easy for some reason on paper. So work out what type of thinking you're after, what you're trying to do, or what type of problem you're trying to solve, and choose the most appropriate technology. And the third thing, the final thing I'd like to suggest is that you get enough sleep. Now this sounds a bit glib, but it seems to be very common these days, especially for men, to brag about how little sleep they've had or how little sleep they need. But obviously the fact of the matter is that sleep is absolutely essential, not just for critically mental health, but for idea generation and problem solving too. And the reason for this is, obviously, when we're asleep, we're not actually fully asleep. Sleep is where we make sense of things, or where our brains make sense of things. And the phrase sleep on it has been around quite a while, but it wasn't until about 1953 that people realized the brain isn't switched off when we sleep. In fact, I seem to remember back in the far dusty recesses of my brain. I read somewhere that the brain uses more energy when we're asleep than we're awake, which probably tells us something that's true. So far from it, when we're asleep, our brains are extremely busy processing the day's information. More specifically, when we're asleep, the brain seems to be taking recent experiences and stabilizing them as memories. And our brains do this all the time, but it's only when we're sleeping, and in particular sleep states, that we actively filter this information, and we sort out what's useful and what's not, and we start linking things together and cross-fertilizing ideas to create other ideas, where we start extracting meaning and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing is that when people try to survive on less than 6 hours sleep per night, it seems that 6 hours is the critical number. A lot of aspects of memory stabilization and learning don't work as well, and if we continue to try to exist on very low numbers of sleep, low hours of sleep, in extreme cases, the memory stabilization and learning doesn't work at all. Now, given that I got up at 4:30 and have had under 6 hours of sleep, I should probably follow my own advice and go back to bed. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Richard. I think we should be very kind to you and only subject you to a couple of questions. So, would anyone? Yes, one here.
No, I don't know. I'd have to look into it, but I'm assuming it was, but it could have all kinds of biases. I can't really answer that.
One more question, anyone? Yes, one over there. I might need to repeat this if you don't shout.
Well, I can recommend a book on that, which I don't think it's out in Australia, but it came out in England about 3 months ago, called Mind Change by Susan Greenfield. I think most probably it is changing, and you would expect it to change. I mean, your story reminds me of somebody who was having a bit of a go at his son, who was sitting on the couch playing some game on a screen, and he said, look, son, this isn't healthy, you should get your friends over. And the sort of 8-year-old's response was, Dad, they're already here. He was playing a multiplayer game. It would seem, I mean, I've got a brain scientist by any stretch of imagination, but if you look at the plasticity of the brain, and you look at how the mind is created, everything that we come into contact with, and I really do mean everything, has an effect on the brain, and that's why I think every single brain is quite individual and quite unique. So clearly, if we start moving from paper-based textbooks to screens, if we start communicating by text rather than voice or rather than in person, this must be having some kind of effect. The only thing we don't know at the moment, as far as I'm aware, is what the effect is. And the reason for that, is, again, as I alluded to earlier on, is first of all, most of this technology that we're talking about is extraordinarily new. Most of it is less than 5 years old. Almost all of it is less than 10. I mean, the oldest would be something like Google, and that's not very old. And we also still don't know enough about how the human brain operates. So unfortunately, and I do have a couple of kids that are right in the middle of this experiment, we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. And my guess is we'll start to get some really good data in about another 5 years, and we should have some fantastic data in about 10 to 15 years. But obviously that might be a little bit late for sort of 5 and 10-year-olds put up with iPads in schools by then. We may have to change direction. But I'm sure it's having some kind of effect without a shadow of a doubt. I think one of the critical things within that, from my mind, is, do we need other people? Is it possible to completely communicate without ever seeing anybody? Or is it possible to live your life completely remotely and virtually? My gut instinct is no. I think we'd go mad, but maybe that will change.
We've had a talk from IBM today talking about machines that are probably getting to the stage that you can have a reasonable conversation with. Do you think it matters if you spend your whole life talking to machines?
Again, We'll find out. My gut feel is it would matter because that great quote, we've got the brains of the Paleolithic, the institutions of the medieval, and the technology of the gods. There's a bit of a mismatch going on there. I think that is going to be an increasing problem. I mean, in Japan, for example, at the moment, there's a real issue with people communicating more with machines than people. There's something on Nintendo called Love Plus, and you can get a digital girlfriend, and apparently it's very compelling to young Japanese men. And somebody, and I think it's probably pushing it a bit, but somebody has actually linked the decline in the Japanese fertility rate to this game, which I think is nonsense. But, you know, they are, you know, and it is men incidentally doing this. It's not women, which is quite interesting. Women don't seem to be interested in digital boyfriends, but the other seems to be true. So we're definitely going to drift into that situation. We are going to spend more time conversing with machines. I mean, this idea of texting is going to go out of the window to some extent because we're going to talk to our machines and they're going to talk back. So we are moving very much in that direction, and it's a bit of an unknown.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much for getting up so early in the morning, and congratulations on taking out the second largest pumpkin in Linfield in the UK this year. Better not, hopefully you'll get back to the #1 rank next year.
Thank you very much. If anyone's coming out to England on November the 5th, by the way, they should definitely go to the other Linfield because they have rather good bonfire night.
Right, thank you very much and sleep well.
Thank you.